This is it, buddy. The big time.
If you've been living under a rock or simply hadn't had internet access for the past 20 years, you wouldn't know how infamous Ian McKellen is to the world of theatre. Now, I wasn't alive during the great boom of Ian McKellen's acclaimed theatrical performances from 1965 to 85, but I've come to appreciate a lot of his ingenious work throughout my time in subsequent drama schools and workshops. Luckily, however, we don't need to just rely on word of mouth anymore. We live in a digital age where most things are archived to some degree, and nothing is more plentiful online than his legacy performances. Most notably, Richard II and Macbeth. The latter being a classic example of how Shakespeare is done right. Fast forward to 2024, and we may just be experiencing Ian McKellen's last Shakespearean performance in the form of Falstaff from Player Kings, a modern rendition of Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. It seems like a lot of talk around this play is mostly revolving around how insanely polished Ian McKellen's performance is as John Falstaff, which for someone in their early 80s is no small feat. It deserves all the praise that we've been giving it. However, I feel like it overshadows talk about the actual play itself. So let's put aside Gandalf and focus on the actual execution of Player Kings and its modern interpretation. It should come as no surprise that it's no short of a masterpiece. Without a doubt, it's modern Shakespeare at its best. I've seen a fair few Shakespeare plays in my day, and my interpretation into the whole modern versus classic debate is that I'm very firmly in the middle. I've seen some god-awful productions, and I have seen some true gems. After a long while of this polarizing roller coaster of emotions, I found myself thinking that modern Shakespeare is unworkable, and no amount of modernizations would make me change my mind. A garbage hot take, I know, but from watching Player Kings, I think it's now been established what makes modern Shakespeare work comes from the idea that there's no strict template to follow because it's up to interpretation. The acting here is amazing. Prince Hal and Henry IV, played by Tahib Jamoh and Richard Coyle respectively, were real highlights. Jamoh really lapped up the whole thieving vibe, which contrasted perfectly with the commanding and terrifying presence of Coyle to make for a really believable family feud dynamic, not the board game. It's a high-budget theatrical West End production. Like, of course it has fantastic set design, lighting, and a dark, gritty visual quality to it all. Needless to say, but it all works as good, if not better, than a lot of modern renditions of Shakespeare's classics. But that's the thing. It's still Shakespeare at the end of the day. These plays were meant to invoke conversation and bring out the best and worst of these character traits. A special experience, no doubt, because it feels like we were transported back to the Elizabethan era, a simpler time for very grand and expansive stories. But the simple parts of Player Kings might be more of a detriment to the overall enjoyment than it is an asset. Henry IV Part 2 was way more influential to me personally than Part 1, which was genuinely frustrating. Part 1 is very samey, and I was able to draw a lot of parallels from Henry V, which is literally just stakes leading towards a big battle. Which makes sense. Henry IV Part 2 was written just 1 year before Henry V, so the blatant similarities in the inspiration can be excused because it was clear he wanted to get these plays out as soon as possible. It's not plagiarism if you copy from yourself. At the end of Henry IV Part 2, however, we get to witness the aftermath of the tragedy and how it affects all the characters and their relationships. This is where I feel like they gave Falstaff more time to shine and diversify his character. He feels very one-dimensional in Part 1, bordering on stereotypical in some aspects. But in Part 2, it feels like he has something to lose. Those primal human emotions come roaring in, which are just completely absent during most of the first act. But with all this being said, I think it's time to put Sir Ian McKellen back into the fray. And in doing so, we get a play that is in service of Falstaff, and not much else. The reason this play is so heavily talked about in conjunction to Ian McKellen is because it's basically a vessel for Ian McKellen's improv comedy, and little else. Every time he went off stage, I just didn't care about the other characters, despite the fact that Falstaff is literally a confidant to Prince Hal, who ends up becoming more of a supposed father figure. But that's what's supposed to happen. But I never got that impression from McKellen's performance because it felt too forced. Like it was thrown together at the last second, as if to say, "Look guys, we did it! We added in important literary devices from the source material. We did it, bro." But that's just something I noticed rather than a general criticism of the play. Because I'm not the biggest Henry IV fan in the world. I haven't studied it to death like I have done with plays like Julius Caesar and Much Ado About Nothing. So I feel like going against the grain and coming up with fresh scenarios is how we can evolve the concept of modern Shakespeare. Just because I'm not a fan doesn't mean it's fact, especially coming from some dipshit YouTuber like me. If you love the original script, then you'll love it here. The only genuine negative outside of a polarizing performance from Ian McKellen is that it's too long, with too much content to fill. But I don't really consider that a negative. Because A, these are ass-old plays used to create entertainment when no one had anything going on in their lives, so in that regard they're supposed to be long since they're rich and sophisticated stories told by one of the best playwrights in history. And B, when you spend upwards of like 90 quid for theatre tickets, you want to get the most bang for your buck, because you can go on Amazon right now and order a 2-disc special edition of Heat, which has Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, which I can watch for a fraction of what it costs to get some of the best seats in the West End selection of theatres. I'll give it an 8 out of 10. I can see why audiences rate it a lot higher and a lot lower. But one thing I can say to try and reel in the naysayers is that Robert Icke has truly created a modern masterpiece. And hopefully this becomes the standard for modern Shakespeare moving forward. My name is Xavier Rippon, and that was my review of Player Kings.